For nearly 40 years, one man stood above presidents, parliaments, and protests, shaping Iran not just with power, but with fear. Welcome to Power and Policy UK, where global politics meets sharp analysis and the stories shaping our world come to life. Imagine a leader whose grip on power was so total that every corner of his nation bore the stamp of his belief system. Every institution bent beneath his will, and millions of lives were shaped, for better or worse, by his iron rule. This was the reality in Iran for nearly 4 decades under Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, a man who started as a relatively obscure cleric and rose to become one of the most powerful figures in the Middle East. Born in 1939 in the holy city of Mashhad, Khamenei entered religious studies early, eventually becoming deeply entrenched in the clerical networks that opposed the Shah's secular monarchy. After the 1979 Islamic Revolution, he navigated the turbulence of new power structures, serving first in government roles and later as president. But it was in 1989, following the death of the revolution's towering founder, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, that Khamenei ascended to his historic position, supreme leader, the ultimate authority in Iran's unique hybrid of theocracy and state. At first, few expected him to dominate Iran's political landscape. Critics saw him as lacking the charisma and scholarly prestige of his predecessor. Yet over time, Khamenei sought not simply to lead Iran, but to remake it in his own image, centralized, uncompromising, and deeply resistant to rivals of any kind. Central to his rule was the consolidation of power around the office of the supreme leader. In Iran's political system, this position holds influence over the military, the judiciary, and the media. Khamenei wielded these powers with a deft and often ruthless touch, pushing aside moderates, sidelining reformists, and ensuring that real authority remained concentrated in his hands and those of his loyal network. But his vision for Iran wasn't limited to internal control. Khamenei shaped the country's foreign policy too, often in stark contrast with the West. He framed Iran's national narrative around resistance to American influence, resistance to Israeli policies, and resistance to what he saw as Western cultural domination. Under his leadership, Tehran extended its influence across the region through alliances with groups and states who shared its anti-Western stance. The result was a regional footprint that reached far beyond Iran's borders, even as economic sanctions and international isolation deepened at home. Whether backing proxy forces in neighboring states or aggressively pursuing nuclear ambitions, Khamenei's Iran became a thorn in the side of Western capitals and a pivot point in Middle Eastern geopolitics. At home, however, this grand geopolitical strategy masked deep societal fractures. Generations of Iranians grew disillusioned as hopes for political openness and economic prosperity collided with a reality of repression and hardship. Repeated waves of protest erupted over the years, in 1999, in 2009, and most recently in the 2020s with the Woman Life Freedom movement, sparked by the brutal death of Mahsa Amini while in morality police custody. Khamenei's response was consistent. No concessions, no compromise. Security forces crushed dissent. Reformist politicians were sidelined. Journalists were jailed, and voices of opposition were either silenced or exiled. Critics pointed to mass executions, severe limitations on free expression, and widespread human rights abuses as hallmarks of his iron-fisted approach to governance. Still, for all his critics, Khamenei maintained a loyal base among conservative clerics, hardliners within the Revolutionary Guard, and segments of the population that saw his resistance to foreign interference as a source of national pride. This base helped sustain his vision of Iran as both a spiritual bastion and a strategic power, even as relations with global powers oscillated between hostility and tentative negotiation. In the end, it was this blend of ideological conviction and authoritarian control that left the most lasting imprint on Iran. Whether in the halls of power, the streets of its cities, or the halls of diplomacy abroad, the mark of his leadership was unmistakable. A nation defined by its resistance, structured around centralized authority, and shaped, for better and for worse, in the image of the man who refused to bend. And now, with his unexpected death in 2026, the question that echoes through Tehran and capitals around the world is no longer just who ruled Iran with an iron fist, but what comes next for a country built in his image. This is Power and Policy UK. Subscribe for bold insights, deeper context, and the power behind the headlines.